is David Lose. I am a proud LTSP graduate with an MDiv in 1993 and an STM in 1997. And I think the STM was in Biblical Studies. We were all new to each other, new to the seminary, second or third day in, and one of my new friends we had met 24 hours earlier asked if I was going to go to chapel. And I said, didn't we just go last night? And he said, oh no, there's chapel every single day. And I was like, chapel every day? Are we supposed to go every day? And he said, oh yeah, it's going to be fantastic. And I was like, is it required? No, it's not required. So I couldn't imagine going to church every day, going to chapel every day, even though I was coming here to be a pastor. But what I found was I started going with him and with some friends, and I loved it. It ended up being one of the most formative and important parts of my theological education, which of course wasn't part of the structured theological education. It was worshiping in community. And so one of the things I remember is how important chapel and worship life was to all of us. Actually, not to all of us, because that friend stopped coming regularly. But he got me hooked in to regular chapel attendance and to worship together, to see my professors in a different light, to hear a variety of voices interpret scripture, to proclaim the word, to have a variety of worship styles. It really became an absolutely indispensable part of my own formation, and I'll never forget that element of life at LTSP. When I was thinking about going to seminary, I was actually coming out of a somewhat conservative background, not my parents or family so much, but in college I got very involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which was a great group for me at that time. But I then thought about seminary and wondered, should I go to an evangelical school? Should I go to a Lutheran school? I was kind of had the sense evangelical school would be too conservative for me, but I was a little worried about the Lutheran school, so I thought, well, I'll go and I'll give it a chance. And the first thing we did at orientation was gathered as a class, and we had our 4 professors who were going to be teaching us that fall semester, and they each talked about their faith and their hope for our faith development while we were here. And I remember just relaxing and thinking, what was I worried about? These people are so transparently Christian and care so deeply about Christ Church that I absolutely knew I was at the right place. And Phil Cray was a brand new professor that year. In fact, he was there for a 1-year appointment. And then later in the year, we called him to be a professor of history with us. And I will never forget what Phil said in those couple of minutes, because it has stayed with me and helped me and has been something I've shared with students too. He said, I'm Phil Cray, I teach early church history, which means I deal a lot with the heresies of the church. And you will probably discover that a lot of the theology you've carried with you your whole life is actually heretical. And he said, but don't worry. That doesn't make you a heretic. You need 2 things to be a heretic. 1, you need to have wrong doctrine. 2, you need to be in a position to do damage to the church. And then he paused and said, and guess what? None of you are in a position to do damage to the church. Which I love, because it became this word of absolute freedom to explore and try ideas out and not worry that the theological police were going to come and jump on you or cart you away. And in fact, during that whole semester, I realized 2 things about myself. 1, I had done a lot of theological thinking without calling it theology as a child, as a young adult in college. And 2, in fact, most of the conclusions I came to were heretical. But it was okay, because I was not yet at a place to do damage to the church. One of the very formative professors for me was Dr. John Ruman. And Dr. Ruman was a gentle and kind soul in every possible way. And at the same time, most of us found him unbelievably intimidating. Not because of any way that he interacted with us, he was always incredibly kind, but because he was so damn smart. And he knew so much. And one of my regular recollections of time with him is that on any given issue, whether it was an issue of grammar in Paul's letter to the Romans or theology of justification, its relationship to sanctification, Dr. Ruman would not just offer you a comprehensive view, a comprehensive explanation of one view or his view, but he would give you a comprehensive explanation of every view that had been articulated in the scholarly literature, to the point that when you were done, you had no idea what he really thought. And my respect for him was so great, there were times I just wanted to raise my hand and say, Dr. Ruman, could you please just tell me what you think, because that is good enough for me. But he wouldn't. He made us think. And he made us think even-handedly about differing positions. And I really valued that willingness to take seriously different sides of an argument, to listen deeply, and to not commit yourself too quickly. My advisor when I was first here as a junior was Gordon Lathrop, who was my advisor before he went on sabbatical. And I came out of a relatively conservative background, not my home, but my college experience at university, which was a great experience for me, but it had raised questions for me about communion and the real presence and infant baptism, why we're baptizing infants, and all these kinds of things. I think my parents were glad I went to seminary because they were getting tired of me plaguing them with all these questions. And I was learning all kinds of things about Lutheran theology, and I finally made an appointment with my advisor. I was really getting anxious that I didn't belong here. And at one point, as I was talking through, I think it was around baptism, Gordon leaned forward and just said in that very pastoral, I don't remember if he pulled his glasses off, but that when he would do that, when he was talking passionately but also kind of tenderly, and he said, you may not be Lutheran, and that's okay. And I remember thinking, no, it's not. I'm the 6th generation Lutheran pastor in my family. It's not okay to not be Lutheran. But what he did was actually create space for that possibility of ending up somewhere else, and that allowed me the space to realize I was Lutheran. And that first year of discovering both what Lutherans really thought and that it resonated as deeply true with me was an incredible, incredible experience. Another very formative professor for me was Tim Wingert, who was our confessions professor. And he also began the year I began. In fact, at the opening picnic around orientation, I remember him walking across. He's about 10, 15 years older than I am, and introducing himself to Tim, as Tim to me. And I said, oh, hi, Tim. And then he said, and I'll be your confessions professor. And I said, nice to meet you, Dr. Wingert. He was not only a great historian and is a great historian and is a very fine teacher, but also had a great sense of humor and a way of opening up the faith in different ways. And so his lecture on the Lord's Supper and the sacramental debates and controversies between Lutherans and Reformed and all of the rest focused on the doctrine of the real presence. And so his lecture title that way was, Guess Who's Really Coming to Dinner? Which I loved. And as he was lecturing, one of the stories he told, he was talking about the importance to him, to the Lutheran tradition, of Christ being really present there in actual bread and wine. And it wasn't that it was changed from the real to bread and wine of Jesus' body, transubstantiation. God deigned to take form in human shape, met us where we are, nor was it simply a memorial. We weren't just remembering Jesus' sacrifice. It was really God really there for us. And the story he used was about his last Sunday as this pastor in Roberts, Wisconsin, and serving, giving, sharing the Lord's Supper with all these people coming forward, and the 6 years or so that he had been their pastor, and knowing their stories and their brokenness and their hopes and their joy, and to each person, Christ was coming in this meal that was really bread and wine, just like they were real people, and yet really God there for them. And I remember listening to him, and then all of a sudden being aware that I was crying, and sort of like looking on both sides, thinking, I hope no one's watching, I hope no one notices. But I think we all were just wrapped with theology made real. And that's when I just realized this is my tradition. This is the kind of church and seminary I want to be a part of. And from that day on, I started wearing what I called Lutheran glasses. And it was interesting for me the rest of that first year to start looking at everything, whether it was family or politics or you name it, through this distinct Lutheran lens that became for me new eyes to see the whole world differently. And that's what I hope seminary does. That people come, we meet them where we are, and we invite them to look at themselves, their lives, their faith, their neighbors, and the world differently from this very graced, this very evangelical, in the strongest sense of good news way. Vocational discernment for me has always had, it feels like 2 or 3 common elements. One is that it was a long journey. It took a lot of time, a lot of thinking. The other was when it finally dawned on me, it felt pretty clear. It felt like, okay, this is the right thing. The third piece is that it almost always came from a chance for me to try it out. So I'll give a for instance. I grew up in a parsonage. My dad was a pastor. I have uncles who are pastors. I have grandfather, great-grandfather, great-grandfather. So the idea of being a pastor was not entirely novel. And when I was little, I would, in church, I would say my dad's parts. Like I knew the liturgy inside and out, backwards and forwards. And I found his parts kind of more interesting. So when I was very little, I always thought I'll be a pastor too. And then for a long time, it wasn't as attractive, wasn't as interesting. I wasn't sure I wanted to be just like my dad was, which was nothing about my dad. It was just more that adolescent thing, defining yourself. When I realized I really wanted to be a pastor, felt called, was when I had been teaching for a year at a private school in Indiana. And the chaplain had invited me to share in his ministry with the students, to lead Bible study, to be with the students. What I got a chance was to try it out that identity and what that looked like. And it was after about 9 months of that, living in that possibility, that on a long drive home, I'd actually still been thinking about going to law school and had decided to put it off and was entertaining a job in Washington. And I thought to myself, this will be a good job for 2 or 3 years till I figure out what I really want to do. And on the drive home, I thought, well, that's fine, but if I can figure out what I want to do, why not start now? And so I started thinking about different life experiences in college myself, in a fellowship group, in this role with students. And as I started thinking about all the things that gave me energy, the things where I felt like my heart was singing when I was doing the work, it all related to relationships that were a lot like pastoral relationships. Doing Bible study, caring for people, teaching, preaching, they were all just really affirming. And I got home, it was an 11-hour drive, plenty of time to think. I got home, I went inside, I sat down, I was kind of surprised at myself and said to my parents, I think I'm going to go to seminary. And nobody else was surprised, which was, you would have liked a little more drama because it was such a big, new idea for me. But it was also some affirmation that seemed right. Something very similar when I wanted to be, when I decided I wanted to teach. I went to seminary solely to be a pastor. I had no imagination of any role beyond that and have always loved being a pastor. At the same time, I remember very clearly that first semester, first week or so actually, watching my teachers, I'm pretty sure it was Dr. Rubin lecturing, and just thinking, I think that's something I'd like to do someday. And then on internship, getting a chance to do the adult forum regularly, and just finding that I loved taking ideas and opening them up and inviting people to play with them and to think about them and to entertain them as real, viable options for the way they live their life. So I think that, allowing yourself time, you don't have to make these vocational decisions overnight. Being ready to be surprised when things fall together. Sometimes they just really fall together. And a chance to practice it. I don't think it's any coincidence that a lot of people that come to seminary had been counselors at our summer camps or had been very involved in campus ministry and had a leadership role in that. The chance to try some things out. And so I think when folks ask me about discernment, whether they're wondering seminary or medical school or be a teacher, I've said, as much as you can, try it out ahead of time. Find a church to volunteer in or look for an internship or do the kind of things that those people in that career do. Talk to them for sure, but try it on for size. And if you feel your heart singing, if you feel yourself just kind of relaxing, then that's a pretty good sign that the Spirit is moving you in this direction. We're having this conversation moments after I received word from the board that they had unanimously elected me president on the basis of the recommendation of the search committee. And there was this moment of absolute speechlessness, not because at this point it's utterly surprising. If you get to that point that you're with the board, one hopes it goes well. At the same time, there was just this moment of it sinking in, that this place that I care about so deeply and that was so incredibly formative in my own life and shaped so many other leaders that I've known that have come before me and have come after as teachers and preachers and administrators and directors of youth groups and Christian education, and now sending them into the public square and service. It is simultaneously this phenomenal honor, incredibly daunting, humbling, and yet honestly beneath it all, absolutely thrilling. That it feels like so many different experiences I've had have come together and put me at this place at this time, and I cannot wait for both the challenges, and there are real challenges, and the opportunities as together we not fashion but discern God's vision for this community. It's been 150 years of training faithful, capable leaders for the church. And what I want to say, in all due respect to that legacy, is this church and world ain't seen nothing yet. Let me say two things about my own sense of vision, mission, hope at this stage in the game. Actually, it's before the game really starts, so subject to revision. First, in all the leadership roles I've played, I have always brought ideas, hopes, dreams to the table, and yet the vision for the group I was leading really only emerged in and through conversation with the whole community. So I don't think the vision is mine. I think my role will be to help steward the community's vision. And I'll play my part. I'll jump in, I'll get excited, but finally it's in conversation with the group that a vision for the institution emerges. And what I get excited about is the caliber of my colleagues here. We have great students, we have great alumni and constituents, but I really want to focus on the staff and faculty. I've had a lot of time in conversation these last couple days with them. And the caliber of our staff and the caliber of our faculty is so high and so great, and their imagination so rich and their commitment so deep, that I feel just plain lucky to be here and to be charged with stewarding the vision of this community. Second thing I deeply believe is that the world has changed significantly in a short time, and that pace of change is only increasing. And in that kind of environment, the very first thing we need to do is admit that we don't really know what to do. Not one of us knows exactly the best way to preach or lead worship or be a congregational leader or be a teacher or be an advocate. None of us really knows the best way to be church. But if we can admit that, if we can kind of say, I don't know, and then follow it up with, but what do you think? Then suddenly we're inviting each other into a conversation. And as much as I believe that none of us really has it figured out, I also firmly believe that collectively, the Spirit has blessed us with sufficient gifts to lean into the future that God is already preparing. Part of that means then we need to be training congregational leaders, people formed and fashioned for leadership in the church and world, who also are willing to learn on the go. We can't anymore imagine we know exactly, here are the courses you need, and here's the skill set you need to be a great director of Christian education, or to work with Lutheran World Relief, or to be a pastor. We need to teach them some of the things that have formed our Christian theological imagination, and then we need to teach them how to keep learning. There's so much information available. But what's the good information? And so how to sort, to identify their questions, to find good sources, to be lifelong learners and ongoing adapters and entrepreneurs. So that's what I would like people to think about when they think about the Philadelphia Seminary, is that they're like, oh yeah, that's the place that took the changing world seriously and trained a cadre, a generation of congregational entrepreneurs and innovators that went after the mission even when they didn't yet know what it was.